Good morning to you all. Glad to be back with you again. This is our third session in a series of 4. I start off saying good morning this time and do it so while we are recording in the morning. Last time we did it in the afternoon. Even brought my German mug out for you, the Guten Morgen mug. English is not my first language. I grew up in North Dakota speaking German, but I decided I better go in English since most of you probably wouldn't be able to follow me in German. I'm going to combine a session here really entitled Hospice and End-of-Life Care, and also involve medical ethics and the legal dimension that's involved in some of those questions. Mentioned earlier, I grew up in North Dakota. We milked cows, and we had a 3-legged stool that we used. Now, you know darn well if you only have 3 legs on a stool and you take one off, you're more likely to topple over. So I use that also in light of what we want to determine in end-of-life care. What is the right thing to do? And there are various dimensions in having that opportunity to do the right thing. So let me put up those 3 that I think the 3-legged stool. And there's sort of a checks and balances involved in this. The one obviously starts with ourselves. When we're looking at doing the right thing, we all believe that we have a conscience. We are a people that needs to do the right thing in terms of then a conscience that I call the moral dimension. We are born with an innate sense of right or wrong. Doesn't necessarily mean we always follow that. And we also would refer to that, as I said earlier, to our conscience. Hopefully we would direct our conscience and inform conscience that we do the right thing when it comes to end-of-life care. But we also know only too well and painfully that not all of us and not everyone in our world always does the right thing. So in terms of the moral dimension, our personal formation, yes, important, but it's not going to be the be-all and the end-all. So we need some other aspects in terms of determining the right thing, and that would probably relate more to what we do in terms of our professional life, the ethical dimension. If you're a medical professional, there's a lot of avenues and a lot of different ways we can go. There's a lot of movement afoot, for example, to make it legal to go ahead and hasten death. Not too sure that we all agree that that would be the right way to go. So we need, obviously, some aspect of this professional guidance to guide us in our terms of our moral. But again, it's not absolute. And we're going to talk about this more in detail later on with regard to the legal aspect. We all need laws to determine the right thing to do, even very simple things like driving on the highway. We can't just willy-nilly drive, imperil ourselves and others. So traffic laws are going to guide us. Is it always going to determine the right thing? Is it absolute? No way. Probably a really good illustration of that, when you're looking at the legal dimension, there would be laws in the South that would prevent you, if you had a dark skin, from eating any restaurant you wanted, using any restroom you wanted, or even what part of the bus you can ride on. Did the law determine the right thing to do there? Again, especially if you're an African American, you would clearly say, no, that's not the case at all. So that's what I'm talking about when we're trying to determine the right thing to do here. These are all going to have a role to play, but none of them are absolute. So with that as a lead-in to an introduction here, let me move on to how we determine then the right thing to do with regard to medicine. So medical ethics is what we're really going to refer to in these comments that I'm going to give. And by way of my background, my doctoral work is in medical ethics, so I deal a lot with these questions in the medical community. Just a little background with regard to the development of medicine. We didn't really need to have guidelines until recently, when we would come into the era I call modern medicine. which really dates back to about 1940, early 1940s with the advent of penicillin. You didn't need a whole lot to sort out because there wasn't a whole lot you could do anyway prior to modern medicine. And what happened for most of medicine in its rich history is the Hippocratic Oath would guide it. The Hippocratic Oath, simply summing it up, deals with people who have a good conscience, a good moral character, are sincere people, and will do the right thing. But I can tell you very clearly, we don't always do the right thing, even if we are very sincere about it. So we need to have a little more of a guideline that determines the right thing to do. And this is where we come up with ethical principles in medicine to guide us in that regard. These are also called self-evident principles, prima facie in the legalese, that you don't have to do a whole lot of exploring and searching and determining the right thing to do, because they are very self-evident. They just stand for themselves. Just to illustrate it very quickly, if I make an appointment with any of you, say you're my doctor, typical male, I don't make appointments easily, and the reason I would make an appointment with you is because I'm not doing well. So what I want to have happen when you're providing your services for me, I want you to make things worse. Oh, that's stupid. I have to be a masochist or you a sadist in order to do that. What we want to have happen is I'm not doing well, and through your efforts, your expertise, your experience, and all of that, I want you to make things better. That's what I'm talking about when we're referring to self-evident principles. And some of the most key, I'm not going to go through all the different guidelines, the medical ethical principles, but let me give you two very important primary ones. What we want to have happen when we interact with medicine, with any of you medical professionals, we want to have patient well-being enhanced. So I'm not doing well. Whatever you can offer me, I'm gladly going to accept so that you will enhance my well-being. There's a fancy word for that. If I were talking in front of you right now, I'd probably test you a little bit. That fancy word in the medical ethical textbooks is called beneficence. I like word study, getting to the root meaning of words. And it's not really that fancy of a word if you know any Latin whatsoever. Bene is your Latin word, adverb for the word bonus, good, and facere, to make. In other effect, if you engage in beneficence, you're going to do well by me. Easily said, but when it comes down to it, there's always going to be a flip side to that. We use the expression in medicine, first of all, don't do harm, primum non nocere. But the fact of the matter is, there's going to be harm that's going to come about in any medical intervention. There's going to be an up and a downside involved in that. There's another Latin expression almost when we call not engaging in maleficence. Here, if you're looking at this word again, this is not the gender, male gender that we're talking about, but the Latin word for evil, bad, and facere again. But the key word in front of that is non-maleficence is what we want to engage in. Not to do harm. Even though we said, first of all, don't do harm, there's going to be that up and a downside. So it really comes down to a very important weighing of what's going to happen with regard to this whole question of doing well, the patient well-being. Another fancy word is we're going to engage in proportionality. And if we're going to determine the right thing to do in terms of that, it's almost like you're going to have a scale and you're going to weigh this particular medical intervention, the up and the downside. And I think if you're a medical practitioner and you can clearly see that this particular intervention is not going to bring the scales on the benefit side, but it's going to cause it to be more on the burden side, I would say you're really bordering and asking yourself very clearly, is that an ethical way to proceed? Is that the right thing to do in terms of this particular question of proportionality? And when it comes to the point of where we are with hospice and end-of-life care, I think another way we could entitle this talk is, when is enough enough? When is enough enough in terms of aggressive curative interventions? I'm going to just take one illness here, and I hope I'm not touching on some sensitive points for you here in this reflection. But if you're dealing with a cancer, particularly when it's very life-threatening, there are three general ways in which we can proceed to try to eliminate, eradicate that. We would probably talk about the chemotherapy route, or the radiation, radiotherapy, or surgery. Truth be known, they don't sound like fancy words, but they are. If you're talking to a 5-year-old, and that 5-year-old comes home and says, "Mommy, my friend's mother is going through," or whoever it might be, "chemotherapy." What is that? How would you explain it? What would be a word that that youngster would understand? And again, this may sound harsh, but basically chemotherapy, most of the word, is a chemical. But even ratcheted down further, it's a poison. Now, in the hands of a skilled oncologist who knows how to provide that, there's going to be a very important test going on in terms of how far do you go, because we've got some powerful, powerful chemicals for chemotherapy. But it may come down to that the treatment, the cure, is worse than the disease. So it gets to be a very painful wrestling. And I would credit a lot of skilled oncologists that they are able to determine this is the route we want to go without causing disastrous side effects. So you go on down the line. Radiation, what do you have in the home that would illustrate that? Our nurses at the office, they like to multitask, and they put a bag of popcorn in the microwave and they walk off and forget about it. And what happens to that popcorn in that bag? It burns. I don't think there's any worse smell that's there around than burned popcorn. So once again, it's burning is what you're talking about. In surgery, it's very easily to ratchet down. That's cutting. So none of us began our day today with a good dose of poison. Then we got the stove extra hot, and then we brought the butcher knife out. Again, I know this sounds harsh, but this is what I want to say, is that the right thing to do in terms of medicine, when is enough enough? When do you say we're going to move someone for their well-being from aggressive curative to aggressive comfort? I used the illustration in one of my previous talks, and I still really, really hit this hard when I talk to medical professionals, particularly physicians. Watch your language when you move someone from the sick to the dying role that I talked about earlier. If you are my doctor and I've made it clear I want to know when things are really not going well, make that very clear. If sure enough things are not, tests show that, and I come to your office and the test results are given me and they're not good, but I keep pushing the doctor, "You're great at this. You can fix me. You can cure. You can get rid of this." And the doctor will stand firm, and finally maybe this is the language that's used, as I said earlier. "Tom, there's nothing more I can do." Now, the physician may well mean there's nothing more I can do in terms of the curative dimension, but how do I see it? How do I hear it as the patient? Often it is translated, and I'm not theorizing here because I've heard it from countless patients, how abandoned and how isolated and neglected they felt when the physician says, "There's nothing more I can do. It's adios, Tom, you're on your own." Here I am, going into a very sacred part of my life's journey, my end of life, where I've got a lot of living to do, a lot of things to do, unfinished business probably, and I have a key player who says, "Good luck, Tom, you're on your own." Rather than doing that, I encourage medical professionals to use a different language. "Tom, aggressive curative treatment will not do you any good. It will not enhance your well-being. It will not be of benefit to you, but we will not abandon you. We will now change the focus of our care to aggressive comfort, aggressive palliative care, if you want to use the fancy word. And I will also line you up with a program that specializes in that. I will line you up with a hospice program that will enable you to live life fully to the very end. That would be the right thing to do in terms of transferring all of this to end-of-life care. So again, if I were present to you and I offer you opportunity for questions, but since that's not the case, If you do want to follow up, I'd be glad to visit with any of you on a one-to-one basis as we move along. There's a number of other things that could be said here, but going back to my earlier point, the Hippocratic Oath is great for that first level of the right thing to do, but it's going to need a lot more expertise to be able to move through all of this, and this is where the principles of medical ethics really come to bear. Part of what I had promised when we set up this series of programs is that I would deal a good deal with the legal dimension that I just talked about earlier. And this ties into the second very important point about medical ethics and the principles that are involved. Head just up here, the very first top one, and in some medical ethical principles, you're going to have people list this second one first. But asking the question for you first. So here we are. The first guideline is we want to make sure patient well-being is what's addressed. Now, who determines Tom's well-being? If you ask my mother, she would probably say, well, my doctor does. No, I don't think so. So who determines my well-being? Who determines any of the well-being for you in terms of medical intervention? So we go on, secondly, to patient self-determination. It is up to the patient to determine how far and to what extent this is going to go in terms of medical interventions. How aggressive are we going to be? And this, I will grant you immediately, is going to be on the relative, subjective side. You've got the 95-year-old great-grandmother dealing with, say, some kind of cancer, for example, breast cancer. She may well say, I'm not going to be aggressive at all in terms of the curative dimension. I'm going to go immediately to the route of comfort care. Versus the 35-year-old mother with young children to raise yet, maybe the same kind of diagnosis, she might well want to be much more aggressive in terms of that and be willing to endure some of the more disastrous side effects, the downside, the burdensome aspect of it. So I am in no way, when I work and consult with people in terms of the right thing to do with regard to medical intervention, I always take that into account, that it is really up to them to determine how far they want to go. Patient self-determination. And the fancy word that would be involved with this one, probably more likely to guess, autonomy. Mentioned earlier about my penchant for roots, the root meaning of words. Here we're talking with the Greek. Self, automobile, it moves itself, and nomos, norm or guide. Here's what we're talking about. The norm or guide in terms of what we do or don't do, patient self-determination, really rests in the hands of the individual, if the individual can do that. Patient self-determination, autonomy. There's another legal aspect that comes into that. So here I am. I've got this particular issue going on. Dr. Dalton here is going to be involved in whether or not I'm going to go this particular route. Before he can do anything, he needs to get consent from me. There is no way anyone can do something in terms of medical intervention without my consent. And how will I be able to say yes or no in a very informed, I'm using the word again, in a very legal sort of way that makes it legal? I need information. And when it comes right down to it, there are two challenges involved in getting the proper information. One would be just the words that are used. Medical jargon can be very difficult to follow, can't it? People often say, well, it sounds like Greek to me. You know why it sounds like Greek to you? Because a lot of times it is Greek, or it's Latin. Personally, I've had lots of years of Latin and also taught Greek at one time. So medical language is not a big challenge for me, but I will say immediately it could be a big challenge for many of you. And we also need interpreters a lot of times, and God bless their hearts. The nurses often end up doing that. They're the interpreters for what comes across. So the words are important in terms of getting it ratcheted down. But here's the other thing. most of the time when you have to make a decision regarding medical treatment, you are going to be under a lot of stress. And let's face it, none of us process well when we're under the gun. I don't care who we are, how well educated we are, how mature we might be. We don't do well under stress. Let me give you an illustration of that. I was working with an ethicist from St. Louis. We were doing some workshops together. And he told this story about this importance of making sure that patients are supported, that they can give informed consent and really carry out autonomy. He talked about a child being brought to the emergency room, this large hospital in an urban area, metropolitan area. And the child, despite the best efforts of the nurses and the doctors, died. Doctor came out, he tried to be kind, I suppose, using euphemisms, wanting to not shock the mother too much. And he said, I'm sorry, your child didn't make it. We don't know what's going on. And we need to do an autopsy to figure out what happened, in case there's something contagious and so on. The mother left, didn't seem to be unduly emotional about it all, still under stress. Came back the next day and wanted to know if her child made it through the autopsy okay. Now you can say, well, everyone understands that word autopsy, what that means, that death has occurred. You're going to do a study as to what happened and what occurred there. So even though that mother may have understood the word, how about her emotional state? She was just not able to process that. We need to be careful in terms of that. And there's been a lot of legal cases where somebody, say, went under the knife, didn't turn out well. They ended up going into a suit, medical malpractice, and the law actually came out on their side, said they really did not give proper informed consent in a legal sense because one of these factors may not have been there. So again, a very important issue in terms of autonomy. But here's the problem that we have in the setting that you and I are in. Lead into this a little more of an illustration. So modern medicine has done a lot in terms of both quality and quantity. If you were a female child born in 1900, to what age could you expect to live? 48, generally given, 1900. Here's a female child born in 2023. To what age could that child expect to live? We're not there yet. I actually heard this on public radio. They flipped the 48 to 84. So when you get right down to it, how many of us lose what we call decisional capacity at 48? Not too likely unless you get into disastrous situations, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, like the young people that are the classic profile cases, the most recent one, Terri Schiavo, Nancy Cruzan, Karen Quinlan. Not too likely, but at 84, it can be very likely we use decisional capacity. So if we're going to still continue in patient self-determination, how are we going to do that? How's that going to happen? That's going to be the big challenge involved here. Switch over now, this is just continuation of this particular point here, carrying out autonomy. Get into the point of advance directives. I'm sure you've all heard the word. Just put this up here as a general category. And before I get into that, just a case again that brought this to the attention of the country. It was a very high classic case that had a high profile, the Nancy Cruzan case. Nancy Cruzan had the disastrous accident in the 80s in Missouri, not too far across the line from Kansas, southwest Missouri. A young woman who then lost total decisional capacity went into what is called a permanent vegetative state, which sounds kind of bad, but what that really says is that she had no upper brain functioning left. All she had left was what controls the automatic, the autonomic functions, like breathing and heart rate and so on. So that's the only thing was left was the brainstem. And the parents of Nancy Cruzan wanted to take all life support interventions away, allow her to die. It was not going to cause her death. It was going to allow the underlying conditions of the car accident to run its course, resulting in death. a huge difference between allowing death and causing death. Make that very, very clear. It's also very clear from the ethical aspect the right thing to do there. So you need to ask yourself, when it came right down to it with regard to medical interventions, what was the right thing to do for Nancy Cruzan? Continue to keep a warm body around, what is called vitalism, or allow her to leave, transcend the body, move beyond that, and be freed from that and live more fully? If you have a faith concept, as I'm sure you would in your church here, that it doesn't end when the body shuts down. It simply allows us even to live more fully. So the parents were willing to do that, stop those medical interventions we call life support. Maybe just a little side here. I, when dealing with some families, often remind them or ask them if they find it difficult to remove those interventions, is your loved one really engaging in anything more than just being alive, a warm body, vitalism? Are they able to engage in the deeper dimensions of what I mentioned in the last tape, those deeper dimensions of psychosocial spiritual functioning? And some of them with great tears and emotion might say, no, there's really nothing going on. There's no way of intervening with us anymore, no way of interacting with us. And so rather than maybe using the word life support, because we're not really supporting life in its deeper definition, all we're now supporting is a body. So I said, is it really life support or is it body support? And I think once you start framing it that way, the decision, even though very difficult yet emotionally, will become logically, in the head kind of concept, a little easier. No, we're just simply having body support rather than life support. So having said that, it finally went, the Nancy Cruzan case, to the Supreme Court in the early 1990s. And in 1990 or 1991, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the state of Missouri was not wrong in continuing to provide this support for Nancy Cruzan because she left no directives in advance about what she wanted or did not want done. No legal papers were filed whatsoever. And so the state said they had to assume that Nancy Cruzan would want that. But it was also very interesting because what was really at key was the whole question of medical intervention we call medically assisted nutrition hydration. And Sandra Day O'Connor said in a dissenting opinion that this was a medical intervention, but whether or not she would want it, that we don't know. A lot of what happened in terms of that case with the parents, and I got to know the parents actually. We invited them to do some workshops for me. And Joe Cruzan, just a kind of a follow-up to that, it was so difficult, this whole battle that he went through. And he got into profound depression and ended up taking his own life. I'm going to illustrate that a little bit more in terms of doing these advanced directives, how we give a gift all the way around when we execute those documents. So long story short, what also came out of the decision, the Supreme Court decision, was this patient self-determination was really, really highlighted very, very strongly. That adults have a right to determine with regard to end-of-life care what they want or don't want done, how aggressive they want to be or how they want to move that aggressive curative to aggressive comfort. In the state of Kansas, giving those directives, the first one was in 1979, and it's called the Living Will Declaration. A good document as far as it goes, but it really didn't have very strong legal teeth to it. The Living Will Declaration basically says that in the event that two physicians determine that my illness is one that is terminal, that is not going to really result in overcoming it, that we need to now move from aggressive curative to aggressive comfort. Simply allow the dying process to take place. Let me illustrate with a very hypothetical situation why this is not the strongest legal document to direct us with regard to what we want or don't want done. Mentioned growing up in North Dakota, large family, I'm number 8 out of 10. I have a younger brother, Tony. I've only executed this living will declaration. That's the full title in the Kansas statute. I'm unconscious already, unresponsive. I lost decisional capacity, and I've made clear to my physicians. They said, yes, Tom is terminal. He wants just comfort care for the last part of his life journey. But then Tony comes in and he said, yeah, but Tom picked on me constantly. We're growing up on the farm in North Dakota. I want to put him on all the aggressive curative intervention he can, because I want him to suffer as much as possible before he dies so I can get even with him. So, humorous story. But the other one, the hypothetical, and Tony specializes in, as a lawyer, in malpractice. There's a saying in terms of the medical community, dead patients don't sue, live ones do. So here you are, you're the doctor. Tony's threatening a suit if you don't follow his directions. Whose directions are you going to follow? This piece of paper, my living will declaration, or are you going to follow Tony, the malpractice lawyer? Going on more seriously to the other part, that's a much more powerful legal document. This was legislated, as did most states, in terms of following up. In 1989, it's called, I'll just put the abbreviation up, Durable Power of Attorney, better get that correct here, Durable Power of Attorney for Health Care. In that title, all of these words are important here. I'm not wanting to pretend that I'm a lawyer here, but what we're doing in giving power of attorney is we're authorizing someone legally to act in our name. And you can give power of attorney for all kinds of things, including financial. Durable means it endures through death or incapacity, probably said better. If you have simple power of attorney, it ceases at the time that person loses decisional capacity. But durable means it endures. And I'm giving that power of attorney very specifically for health care. Powerful document, and holds as much legal power as I said earlier with regard to if I'm still in charge of what's going on with regard to medical care, and you as a physician don't follow that, you're liable not only for civil but also for criminal. You cannot use the knife getting my wallet in the alley or getting my wallet in other ways with medical intervention. Very powerful document that has strong legal teeth to it. Durable power of attorney for health care. In this particular document, I'm able to what is called choose an agent. Legal terms again, I'm the principal, I'm executing the document, and I can choose whoever I want as my agent to act in my name, giving directions with regard to my medical care. It's very important with regard to the individual that you choose here. Spouses will usually choose each other. Very good point. Wife will choose husband, husband will choose wife. If you're traveling and you get in an accident, you may both be incapacitated. If you only choose each other as the agent, then it's in limbo again. What the document, the legal document, allows you to do is choose your primary agent and then alternates. And you can choose as many alternates as you want. Important as to the individual that you choose. Give you a quick illustration on a consult I was called in on. I was actually out of town. I'm available for ethical consults. I serve on the ethics committee for several large medical entities here. And they had an interesting case. Individual was on dialysis, no kidney function left. He finally decided, talked about earlier, the well-being, proportionality, that it was not really doing him any good anymore. And in common language, what I often tell people is, if you want to ratchet down the medical language and the medical ethical principles, we want to do 4 people, not 2 people. And his conclusion was, it was really hurting him more, all the dialysis he had to go through and the hassle that was involved in that. So he told the medical professionals, simply stop dialysis. If he stopped dialysis, he had no kidney function, the poisons, the toxins would build up, he'd go into a coma and very peacefully slip away. He had one child, his spouse had died, Daughter insisted to Dad, Dad, you can't do that. If you stop dialysis, you're going to die. He says, I know, but that's the that's the route I want to go. It's what really is best for me. His own personal moral, his conscience, his individual choice was really on target. Despite the daughter's protestations, he still had decisional capacity. The medical professionals had to follow him. They shut down the dialysis. Toxin spilled up. He went into a coma. As soon as he lost the ability to decide, it's called a triggering circumstance, the agent kicked in. The daughter now had the authority to direct his medical care. And she said to the people, the medical people, hook him back up. Then she also threatened, if you don't and my dad dies, I'm going to sue you for wrongful death. Well, that got the attention of the professionals. So they decided, well, we need to get some advice. They called me what I thought. So I led them through what's going on clinically. Was he still benefiting? No, it's really proportionality. He was not benefiting at all anymore. The best thing to do here, good medicine, would be to disconnect. And said, well, why don't you disconnect? Because the daughter now has legal power. She's the one directing his care. And so I kind of played around a little bit. So in effect, you were engaging a little bit of CYA here. You know, CYA is cover your butt. Well, yeah. And so I says, what would be practicing good medicine here? Stop the dialysis, that would be good medicine. Sometimes not to do is good medicine. So we went on through some more of this, and I pointed out to them that I know of no single case in Kansas where a medical entity has lost the suit for practicing good medicine. What you're going to lose, where you're going to lose, is if you practice bad medicine. So you've got a choice here. You're going to do the CYA, practice bad medicine, or you're going to practice good medicine and not hook them up. So they decided not to do that because you go round and round and hook them up again and take them off again, back and forth. The patient died peacefully. The daughter did not sue. You may ask, well, why when he became lucid again after they had put him on dialysis, did he not change the agent? That's all water under the bridge. Only child, the hassle of all of that going on. My point always here is be careful as to the agent you choose. And then secondly, and much more importantly, have conversations. Have the conversations with your agent as to what you want or don't want. So that becomes a lot easier for that person to determine, yes, this is what Tom would have wanted or not wanted. So with regard to the agent, choose carefully. When it comes to the spouse, naming each other, yes, but also name the alternates. So those are all very important. So with regard to that, you can choose whatever or whomever you want with regard to that. I'll just put a question mark on there. I had conversations when I filled out my durable power of attorney with the agents I chose, my primary, my alternate. I simply put on there they have complete authority. And then I also outlined on my particular form my agent or agents have authority, clearly determine those four basic aspects of life support, the body support. They have authority in terms of renal, they have authority in terms of dialysis, the kidney, the renal functioning, nutritional, and cardiac. All of those. And I didn't say do or don't, because they need to determine from the physician what's going on with regard to are there reasonable hopes of recovery or not? Is Tom going to benefit or not? So those are the things that are very important in terms of getting down to the particulars of the advance directive. I'm going to now also lead this into the point about the difference between advance directive and medical directives. When I gave those four, I was really giving medical directives, and a lot of people confuse these two here. People go to a lawyer and they ask about having all of these things covered. My point when I'm giving programs is, where do you start and where do you end when it comes to giving particular directives regarding this care or that care? You have to write volumes because there's an endless array of medical interventions. Where do you begin and where do you end? Repeat what I said earlier. Have the conversations. In our program at Harry Hines Hospice, we do have one particular way in which we try to educate our patients, and I actually had Melody write this out because I always forget what this stands for. The TPOP form, Transportable Physician Orders for Patient Preferences. And it allows the patient to make determination as to how aggressive they want to be with regard to nutritional, medical assisted nutrition hydration, cardiac, the DNR, all of those points. It's a good tool for education. And this allows then the agent here also having some medical directives as to what to decide or not to decide. I'm getting close to my end point here. Let me finish here with the Terri Schiavo case that caught the attention of the nation through the 90s and then into the early 2000s. Terri Schiavo had a massive heart attack, medical language MI, myocardial infarction, in the mid-90s. A young woman, 25, and she went on oxygen for 10 minutes, massive brain damage, all upper brain functioning gone. Through testing, it was clearly shown. She still had the brain stem controlling those vital functions. Her husband, Michael, kept her on the body support for 8 years, finally decided nothing was going to change, nothing was going to happen. But her blood family, the Schindlers, decided aggressive treatment, keep her going, warm body, vitalism. It went through 15 court proceedings. And finally, in 2005, the interventions were removed. She was allowed to die. So you have to ask yourself, what was the cause of Terri Schiavo's death? Well, some on one side would argue strenuously her death was caused by starvation. Nutrition, hydration was removed. Extensive autopsy was done. Autopsy showed very clearly there was no upper brain functioning where decision making is possible, only the brain stem. What the coroner wrote on that in the 36-page autopsy was, in terms of the cause of death, fancy word here, anoxic encephalopathy. It translates very easily, brain death caused by lack of oxygen. Now, there were a lot of legal questions about Terri Schiavo, whether he suffocated her, whether he had done this or that. And the coroner said, I cannot determine the manner, what caused the lack of oxygen. But he did go to the emergency room where the hospital where she was admitted, and MI was lifted. So it's very likely there was no sinister kind of thing going on, no crime committed, that in effect the lack of oxygen was caused by the heart attack. There are still people to this day say that Terri Schiavo was starved to death. We have to go now and determine if again, this happened in 1900, lack of oxygen for whatever reason, drowning, this or that, she would have died very shortly. But we had all of these interventions in modern medicine that extended this out, kept death at bay for 15 years. Now you have to go back ethically and determine the lack of oxygen was to the MI. She was not killed. She was not caused to die. She was allowed to die. That's where I think we really need to go very clearly when we're talking about when is enough enough. When do we allow the underlying condition to bring about death and our loved one being able to go home to heaven? I'm going to conclude finally one final story with my experience in hospice. I had this woman who moved in from out of town, stayed with her daughter here, and as she was dying, I provided pastoral ministry for her, gave her the last rites, as we call it. And I was in the home with the patient, with the daughter, with the patient's granddaughter, and her daughter. So 4 generations of women. After I'd done my ritual, I stayed there to provide support for the family. And the daughter was distraught, saying goodbye to her mom, and rightly so. The patient's granddaughter said to her mom, Mom, it's okay. Grandma's spirit has outgrown her body. Time for Grandma to let her body go. It's a beautiful way to sum up what I'm saying here. There comes a time when we need to let our bodies go home to heaven. And we can keep a warm body around for a long time, but to what end or purpose? I know these decisions are difficult, they're painful, they require a lot of wrestling, and I hope my comments have helped you with regard to that. And again, if you want to follow up with some personal conversations about this, please feel welcome to call me. Thank you again for your attention.